What crazy person in history was right the whole time? The lady who sued McDonald's for hot coffee. Everyone treated her like some ridiculous entitled Karen, but she was 80 and the coffee was so hot the skin on her legs fused together and he was hospitalized. She wasn't crazy at all. We did a case study on this. She suffered, if I remember, third-degree burns from that coffee. Third degree. That should tell you that coffee is way hotter than it should be. The McDonald's had been fined numerous times for their coffee being way hotter than what policy dictated. The worst part is that she needed multiple surgeries and medication for the rest of her life. She initially asked for just $20,000 to cover medical expenses, but McDonald's offered $800,000, so she sued. Jury found McDonald's at fault and awarded her $300,000. The frivolous lawsuit narrative was a heavy and effective PR push that spread like wildfire through primarily conservative media. That whole thing could have been avoided if McDonald's had done their jobs right. They deserve to get sued for their negligence. Courtney Love. She tried to warn us about Weinstein. When asked if she had any advice for young actresses, she said, "If Harvey Weinstein invites you to a party at the Four Seasons, don't go." She was immediately banned by the biggest Hollywood agencies. A lot of them who today talk about being all about Me Too but help Harvey Weinstein keep up his sexual predation back then. People in Hollywood knew about Harvey Weinstein years before Courtney Love talked about it. Tarantino on Joe Rogan recently said that there's no doubt everyone who worked with him for more than a week didn't know about all this. It was no secret. It was an open secret. A lot of people heard rumors about it, but few had first-hand knowledge. Want an example? First, you should know that the Courtney Love tape is from 2005. In 1997, Rose McGowan confided in Ben Affleck that Weinstein had raped her. Affleck's response to her was, "God damn it. I told him to stop doing this." John Yudkin, the single scientist who didn't believe the sugar industry's research that demonized fats. Till his death he's adamant that fats weren't the cause of obesity and heart attacks. Margaret Dunbar. In 1912 her 4-year-old son went missing and one day the cops found him and brought him home. Except it wasn't her son and everyone tried to gaslight her into believing it was. Well, she was right and no one knows what happened to the real Bobby Dunbar to this day. And who was the new Bobby? Another boy named Charles Anderson that was given into the care of a traveling handyman. He resembled Bobby so the police took him and gave him to Margaret. Worse, actually. The actual parents were the ones saying, "What the fuck, that's our kid you took," and the Dunbars agreed with police that it was their son. The actual parents couldn't afford lawyers and it wasn't proven until decades later after their grandchildren took DNA tests. Sinead O'Connor when she ripped up the picture of the Pope. Corey Feldman talking about child sex abuse in Hollywood. Actress Jean Zaberk wasn't paranoid. The FBI were out to get her. She most likely died from the torture they did on her. She lost a child because of this and she probably attempted. Again on the anniversary of the death of that child, premature baby that died 2 days after birth. Alfred Wegener figured out continental drift in 1912, but nobody would buy it until research in oceanography and geology proved it in the early 1960s. I don't know that guy's name but he basically from 1541 to 1542 traveled across South America. The first European to do so. While he was on his journey he said he saw millions of people in large cities, with a lot of life in them, where today is the Amazon rainforest. After he had finished his journey he had told the stories of those cities and about 100 years later when explorers visited the place there was nothing, no cities, no people, just jungle. So they thought he had made all that up. But modern technology has shown that there might have actually been a lot of cities there, and that those people died out with smallpox and all cities were covered by the jungle within the course of 50 years. So basically people thought he was crazy and made everything up, but in modern times it's proven that he was right all along. You're talking about the Spanish expedition that went from Peru to the beginning of the Amazon and then floated down. They passed a thriving town about once a day and they brought smallpox and influenza with them. I think 4 out of 30 Spaniards survived the trip. The diseases they already had plus tropic disease and parasites wrecked them just about as badly as the plagues they brought with them wrecked the civilization they went through. The population of the Americas dropped by at least 70% in the century after 1492. It seems impossible for a single boat of 30 people to be responsible for the near annihilation of an entire civilization of millions, but it actually happened. That concept is always percolating in the back of my mind any time that time travel is discussed. Lindy Chamberlain, the dingo ate my baby lady. Her daughter, Azaria, was taken by a dingo when I was in late primary school. I'm Australian, and I vividly recall how she was horribly attacked and judged by the public. It destroyed her marriage. She spent time in prison for murdering Azaria and delivered a child whilst incarcerated. Not Australia's finest moment, how it treated this grieving and traumatized mum. Out of curiosity, what was the court's reasoning for her killing her child? I mean, it's not like she took out a life insurance on her child or something, right? Some sort of speculation that the baby was sick and the parents didn't want to get treatment for their baby. Media backed this up by the fact that the family was Seventh-day Adventist. Every conspiracy theorist that believed in MK Ultra before US released it was all real. Fun fact: conspiracy theorist was a term popularized by the US government to discredit whistleblowers that tried to expose things like MK Ultra in the first place. Trump. The FBI and NSA were spying on him in his campaign. You are objectively correct, yet you are being downvoted. So I'ma say you. Lord Kitchener, Horatio Herbert Kitchener, Secretary State of War for the British Army. At the onset of World War I, everyone thought the war would end very quickly, either going one way or the other. Kitchener was one of the few people to envision a long war, and to prepare accordingly, even though the British government actively hampered many of his efforts, even though he was a war hero. Speaking of World War I, John Maynard Keynes was one of Britain's representatives in the talks that would establish the conditions of German surrender. He strongly argued against imposing harsh crippling penalties and even did the math showing that it was physically impossible for Germany to fulfill the obligations that were being proposed, even warning about the inevitable revanchism and pretty much predicting, in broad strokes, what would happen over the next 25 years. His concerns were unheeded, so he quit the talks before they were over, and we know how it turned out. He wasn't alone in that, of course. Others could see it too even at the time, but not enough people agreed. Hemingway talked about the FBI following him prior to his. They thought he was paranoid. Decades later some papers get released. Turns out the FBI was following him. Also, if I recall correctly, when his wife sent him to have electroshock therapy, the doctor performing the process was actually a member of the FBI. Why were they following him? Hemingway was aware of his long surveillance by John Edgar Hoover's FBI, who were suspicious of his links with Cuba, and that this may have helped push him to the brink. Hemingway actually acted as an FBI informant while living in Cuba. Moving to the island after finishing For Whom the Bell Tolls, published in 1940, Hemingway began working for the American Embassy in Havana after forming a relationship with Ambassador Spuriel Braden. He recruited barmen, waiters, and others for the low-budget program, which was unimpressive to the Bureau. At one point, Hemingway referred to a government official as a member of the Gestapo, and also constantly showed his contempt for the Bureau. Even John Edgar Hoover stated that it would be the last time they would use someone like Hemingway as an informant. Despite his connection to Cuba, it seems that the FBI did not think that Hemingway had communist leanings. After his ties with the embassy were cut off in April of 1943, Hemingway was still doing work for the Navy, before going on to publish The Old Man and the Sea and win the Nobel Prize in Literature. The Dixie Chicks / Natalie Main speaking out against the imminent invasion of Iraq in March 2003. When every other country music singer was thumping their chests, beating the war drums, and jockeying to be the next Lee Greenwood, she spoke up against the coming war and President Bush, and was crucified for it. Boycotted, received death threats from unhinged hillbillies. Turns out she was right the whole time. I just hope it's never Sigmund Freud. I had a short talk with a guy doing his master's degree in Victorian sexuality, and he told me a lot of Freud's theories are specific to the environment of middle and upper class society of his era. He said that the Oedipus complex comes about because babies were fed by a professional wet nurse and raised primarily by nannies with very little time spent with their actual mother. When they get into late childhood and early adolescence and they start becoming attracted to the opposite sex, they haven't spent enough time around their mother to mentally register her as a relative and therefore unattractive via reverse sexual imprinting, and you combine that with genetic sexual attraction and you get young guys who are attracted to their mothers. Meanwhile, modern guys who are raised in a healthy family environment learn about this supposedly common complex in school and think, what the fuck? Anyone prior to Louis Pasteur who advocated for germ theory? People like Ignaz Semmelweis were openly mocked for suggestions that doctors should wash their hands before assisting with a birth, as he noted that maternal death was significantly lower when midwives washed their hands. He died in an asylum after suffering a nervous breakdown, and was only vindicated decades after his death when Pasteur and his contemporaries' work on germ theory gained traction over the prevailing miasma theory. Diseases and infections were caused by bad air. Poor Semmelweis. He was bullied out of the profession for saying that doctors should wash their hands in between autopsies and delivering babies. One of his peers wrote a pamphlet saying it was ridiculous because gentlemen always have clean hands. John Lydon told a BBC interviewer in 1978 that Jimmy Savile was into all kinds of seediness, and that the BBC probably wouldn't air him saying that. He was right on both counts. His interview with Piers Morgan years later, and the vindication he clearly feels, is a beautiful thing to see. Just watch that doc and it's crazy to me how often Savile said things along the lines of liking young girls and no one took him seriously. He kept saying things like that and everyone just laughed. By any measure, he was one of the most prolific and successful child molesters in the modern era. He had everyone convinced that being a Lothario was all just a part of his goofball act. That, plus his charitable works, which later were revealed to be entirely selfishly motivated, let him hide in plain sight. He never faced any accounting for his misdeeds and died a free and widely respected man. Britney Spears. Craig Ferguson siding with Spears during her run-ins with the tabloids in the 2000s, and his defense of her behavior instead of humiliating her, made me even more admirable of him. Rutherford B. Hayes. Not necessarily viewed as crazy, but largely viewed as a bad or useless president. This is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people no longer. It is a government of corporations, by corporations, and for corporations, said that in the late 1800s. All the people that said the NSA/CIA was spying on us for years. Thanks to Edward Snowden, we now know that was true, and it was so much so that the NSA had built backdoors in pretty much every single electronic device that exists, all the way down to the network switch level on Cisco switches and the internet backbone through AT&T network hubs. The fact that there wasn't mass revolt after that information was released kinda blew my mind. Funny, my dad is not a conspiracy theory person. He assumed every digital communication was monitored even before Snowden, to the point where pet of his teaching me digital safety was, always assume there is a cop watching your computer access. The only other one he believes is that the leaders of the far right are mostly Russia-backed. Can't really say he's wrong there either. Mitt Romney and his comment about Russia. I voted against him, but I'll be damned if he wasn't right about Russia. What did he say? He talked about the influence of Russia and how they are one of our primary antagonists on the world stage. Obama replied by saying, the 1980s called, they want their foreign policy back, during one of the debates. It's also worth noting that during the election Ellen DeGeneres called Mitt the worst candidate that could ever happen to people like her. Only for a few years later we see Romney participating in pride parades. He's also famous for his comment about having binders full of women in reference to lists of female candidates for federal court and agency appointments. Will Rogers, a humorist when he invented the term trickle-down economics as a joke, stating that this type of economy would just make the rich richer and the poor poorer. And then we actually implemented it and used the term trickle-down. And Will Rogers was right. The rent has gone through the roof and our salaries have stagnated and we can't afford the American dream anymore. For reference, trickle-down, or voodoo economics, or supply-side economics, was previously known as horse and sparrow economics, because if you feed the horse enough oats, some will pass through to the road for the sparrows. The idea that poor have to survive by eating the shit of the rich is an accurate description of how the policy actually works. There was a wacko-looking guy on Oprah who stopped his vanilla presentation to tell the audience that plastic causes cancer. Stop using it to store food and water. Oprah cut to commercial and whisked him off the show. Dude was right. VPAs were outed that day, but it took another decade for that info to become public knowledge. Gregor Mendel, he invented modern-day genetics, but people back when he was alive, close to 1890s, thought he was wrong, only to be proven way later on. I found out about this in my 7th grade science class a while back. Martha Mitchell. She was like part of the reason why it was discovered that Nixon was involved in Watergate. Her husband was part of the Nixon group, so she got some inside details. When she wanted to tell the news about the whole scandal, her husband and Nixon men put her in a hotel and restrained her from having any contact with anyone. She was seen as an insane person. Her husband and Nixon's men even managed to convince the psychiatrist that she was out of her mind. Actually, there's a phenomenon in psychology which was named after her, aka the Martha Mitchell effect. Heinrich Schliemann. He 100% believed that ancient Troy had really existed. So he armed himself with a copy of the Iliad, and actually managed to find and excavate the city. He'd told everyone and their sister that Troy was a real place for 40 years before he found it, and everyone thought he was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Not so much, it turns out. But he also dug through the actual site where Troy should have been, believing it to be lower. And he was a terrible person, an archaeologist. So yes, he was right there, but overall a shit human being. Al Gore warned us about climate change in 1999. Actually, he wrote his first book about it in the mid-1980s. Petroleum companies have had internal documents since the 50s proving a direct causal link between man-made CO2 emissions and a global average rise in temperature. They actively used this to stifle opposition research that would also point that same fact out. And people have been making charts since the early 20th century plotting roughly the same thing, but with coal emissions causing a global rise in temperature. Morgan Robertson. In 1898 he published a story about a ship named the Titan, a fictional ship that sinks after hitting an iceberg. Allegedly, and I can't find any proof of this, it was initially dismissed for being too outlandish. 14 years later, the Titanic sinks in an eerily similar fashion. Robertson dismissed all claims of being psychic, and was just familiar with ships at the time and their flaws. And, if I recall correctly, the Titan sank in an area close to where the Titanic actually sunk. North Atlantic, yes. Christine Collins. 1930s Los Angeles. Single mother, husband in prison. Young son goes to the movies one day and never comes home. Goes to the LA cops who had recently very publicly bungled a high-profile kidnapping case resulting in a dead kid. No evidence, no clues, no witnesses, cold case. Until months later she gets a call. Her kid has been found alive. In Illinois. Goes there for a public reunion in front of the press and LA cops. Only she says, "This isn't my kid." Cops say it's been 5 months of trauma. Kids change a lot. Take him home. Publicly pressured by police and reporters she does. Evidence mounts, it's not her kid, she raises a stink. The police put her in a mental institution and accuse her of trying to dump her child. The child has been sent to juvie. There another child comes forward and says he was an unwilling accessory to the abduction and murder of her real child by his uncle, a serial killer with 20 child victims. Yet another major black eye for the LA police. She finds allies and eventually ekes out a minor victory. She wins her court case and the central detective loses his job. Either way, the fake child had heard about her case and wanted to go to LA, so he lied.